So I wanted to spend a little time going through some of these documents that have to do with the reigns of kings in the 13th century that are assigned in the Geary book. This goes along with the earlier video on politics in the 13th century. The first of these documents is the life of Saint Louis by Jean de Joinville, and this is one of the great, we might say, chronicles of the High Middle Ages. Joinville was a courtier. He actually served as seneschal, which is a royal official, and he was a personal companion of Louis IX, and admired the king a great deal, although he didn't necessarily agree with all of the decisions that he made. For instance, I mentioned in the last video that Louis, at the end of his life, decided to go on another crusade, a second crusade, sort of on the basis of rumors that the ruler of Tunis was going to convert to Christianity and help the Christians in their effort to retake the Holy Land, and he sailed to North Africa and then promptly died of dysentery shortly after arriving there. And it seems that Joinville did not approve of this, and in fact did not accompany the king on that journey. But apparently King Louis's wife commissioned Joinville to write a life of Louis, a historical account of his life. And so he spent the next 40 years after the death of the king writing this thing. Joinville was actually like in his mid-80s by the time he finished this, and he lived until he was in his mid-90s. So remarkable life. I guess he was about 90 according to this. I've actually read different dates for him. So in any case, right, this is the life of Louis. One of the things that this demonstrates, and then we're also going to look at the accounts of the enquêteurs, which are these royal officials created by Louis IX, and then we'll look at Magna Carta as well. Okay, so a couple of things that I want to point out about these documents, right? So I mentioned in an earlier video this thesis of Thomas Bisson in his book, The Crisis of the 12th Century, that the creation of government often led to what we might call unintended consequences, led to exploitation of the population, and even to things like violence and harassment, and the government was not necessarily meant to serve the interests of the common people, that those who went to work in government were often of fairly low status. Joinville himself was he was a nobleman, but he was not like the in the family of the Count of Champagne or anything like that. And so these, many of these officials in the emerging governments of these kingdoms were from the lower ranks of the nobility, or they were even drawn from the peasantry itself. And there's almost infinite variation on that. But regardless, one of the main things I think that these documents reveal is how much abuse there was of that power that was placed in the hands of figures like seneschals and bailiffs and reeves, and I mean there are these different officials, right, who existed in the Middle Ages, mostly to collect taxes, but also to they had in some cases judicial functions, to serve as judges in court cases. And these documents make clear that there were lots of abuses. There were lots of problems with this. Joinville, it seems, was also so there was an inquest by the Pope into the life of Louis IX. It began within a year or two after his death, and it ran for over 20 years. It wasn't until like the mid to late 1290s, I think it was 1297 or something like that, that Louis was actually canonized as a saint. And canonization was something that was also being standardized in this period. And Joinville, it seems, was a witness in the inquest, that he was a key source that the popes used to establish his holiness, his virtuous character. And so some of that comes out in Joinville's life of St. Louis, right? I mean, he talks about, for instance, his love for the poor, his worth and uprightness, right? Louis weighed in on even things like, we shouldn't dress uh, in an ostentatious way. And there's this whole conversation about, some of his courtiers dressed much more richly than he did, and Louis was critical of that, right? So this document is meant, or this source is meant to present him as a humble and virtuous and pious Christian, one who is perhaps even worthy of sainthood. The part that I wanted to, well, a couple of things here. Okay, so we see a little bit of that. I really like this particular section of this, and so in this case, right, there's this guy, the Bishop of Paris, was having a conversation with a master of divinity. This would have been one of the teachers at the cathedral school, probably. And it seems that the master, was like, oh, I'm worried about the state of my soul because I have a hard time believing the doctrine of transubstantiation. Okay, in as much as I cannot so command my heart as to believe in the sacrifice of the altar. And this is an interesting, view into the debates that were going on in these learned circles. Actually, by this point, this is the late 13th century, this is the University of Paris, probably, that this is talking about, right? So you got one of the masters at the university who says, I know that I'm being tempted not to believe in transubstantiation. That's a totally plausible thing to happen at that point in time. And the bishop then instructs him, he's like, well, do you get joy out of not believing in that? And he's like, no, it pains me that I can't bring my heart to believe this. And then he says, well, here's a scenario. Let's say that you were put in charge of a castle that was right on the borderland between France and England. And England and France, it seems, were at war at this point. And actually Louis, did some fighting with England. And if you were put in charge of that castle, and I was put in charge of a castle deep in the heart of France that was not at all threatened by the English armies, which of us would be more valuable to the king? And of course the master says, well, the one who was defending the castle that was right in the war zone. And he says, well, yeah, that's exactly like you. You are the one facing these temptations. I'm not. And so it's, you are commended to God, right? And that this sort of thing ends up in an account of the life of the king is interesting. Has really nothing to do with the king, but I think what Joinville is trying to convey here is that Louis created in his kingdom an atmosphere where people wanted to live righteous lives. They wanted to be good Christians. That even, if there were these debates going on at the University of Paris and other places, that, Louis was such a wise ruler that he was able to bring this about. And there's actually the story in the textbook about Louis, traveling through Paris early, very, very early one morning before the sun came up, and there was a young scholar who had woken up to study, and he emptied his chamber pot out the window, and it turned out the king was traveling right underneath the window at that time. And so the king bursts in and grabs the young scholar and demands to know why he just, poured detritus on him, and he said, well, I got up early to study. And Louis was so impressed with him that he ended up giving him a scholarship. And when I tell that story, I tell my students, I don't think this is a good idea to take that as a way to get a scholarship anymore, but it worked for this young man. So Louis fosters that kind of atmosphere. One of the things that scholars have noted about Louis, this is especially in the work of the great historian at Princeton, William Jordan, that Louis was not a friend to the Jews, that he saw the Jews as a threat. And there were frequently, this is really revealing of life of Jews in 13th century France, that they were invited to debate at Cluny, at this prestigious monastery, right? And this sort of thing did happen from time to time. Well, there's this young man there. He's not a monk. He's not a scholar. He's a knight, and he asks the Jew if he believes in the virgin birth and all of that, right? And the Jew says, of course I don't. And this guy then like smacks the Jew in the head and kind of beats him up. And then, the Abbot of Cluny gets after him. And the knight says, no, you're the one who is committing the wrong deed here, because you are inviting a Jew to debate with you, and you're giving him an equal kind of footing in this. And people listening to this, good Christians listening to this, might be confused by this, and it might hurt their faith. And then the king chimes in, right? No one, unless he be a very learned clerk, shall dispute with them, but a layman, when he hears the Christian law missaid, should not defend the Christian law unless it be with his sword. And with that, he should pierce the missayer in the midriff so far as the sword will enter, right? So this good and righteous king who cared about poor people and stuff like that seems not to have been very friendly to the Jews. And in fact, Louis tried to undermine their whole economic enterprise. There's been a fair amount of research on that. Okay. Now, this is the part that I really want to talk about, and there's several examples in this text. Joinville is very ready, and he frequently talks about how Louis sought to curb abuses in his government. And so we can see some of the things he's trying to put into place here, okay? So the king forgot not the teaching of the friar. He was influenced by a Franciscan, apparently, when he was a young man. He had so arranged that my lord of Nesle and the good count of Soissons and all of us who were about him should go after we heard our masses and hear the pleadings of the gate, which is now called the Gate of Requests. So this is the creation of these officials known as the enquêteurs, right? Louis sent these representatives out to hear complaints. And we can see this happening, right? Then he would ask out of his own mouth, this is actually the king is showing how to do this, is there anyone who has a cause in hand? And those who had a cause in hand stood up. Then he would say, keep silence all, and you shall be heard in turn one after another. And so, he's creating these situations where anybody, noble or commoner, can come and make a complaint about some legal situation and be heard by a royal official. Okay? And, and it seems that this was necessary because Louis was being criticized, right? Christendom, which ought to be guarded and preserved by you, is perishing in your hands. This is one of the nobles there, who is saying to Louis, like, you've got real problems in your kingdom, okay? And there are a lot of people who are not, they're excommunicated, and they're not even seeking satisfaction in the church, from the church, right? And Louis says, well, there may be reasons for this. There may be abuses going on in the church that make it so that, in other words, the excommunications were unjust, and these people really shouldn't try to make satisfaction with the church, right? So he seems to have had a pretty good handle on the various forms of abuse that were happening in his kingdom. Some discussion of the Crusaders. I think there's some stuff later in the document here. Okay, yeah, this one. And so this is a little anecdote about how there was a baron who came and reported something to Louis. It says, while I was on my way to Paris, I found 3 dead men on a cart whom a clerk had killed. By clerk, he means a clergyman. So we've got a clergyman running around killing people, apparently. And, they inquire into this, and the provost who is, conducting this investigation tells the king, that the dead men were 3 of his sergeants of the Châtelet who had gone into unfrequented streets to rob people. In other words, these were royal officials who were doing bad things in the name of the king, right? And, this clerk just got really angry with this, and in fact, these 3 then attack this clergyman, and they wound him, and, apparently they take all his clothes, and then he goes to his lodging, grabs a crossbow. It's interesting that this clergyman has a crossbow, and a falchion. This is a sword of some kind, okay? And he goes out and kills these three guys, right? So this is a rather bellicose clergyman, it seems. And, it's like, well, this is a clergyman. He did something wrong here. A priest is not supposed to do these sorts of things. And it's interesting what Louis does here. Sir Clerk, said the king, you have forfeited your priesthood by your prowess. Prowess is a compliment, right? By your military abilities, by your fighting ability. So you have forfeited your priesthood. Like, you can no longer be a priest, but for your prowess, I take you into my service, and you shall go with me overseas. And then this thing I do for you, because I would have my men to fully understand that I will uphold them in none of their wickedness, right? So you did right in killing these royal officials who were robbing people. And then this gets into some of these abuses, right? This is a proclamation made by Louis. We, Louis, by the grace of God, King of France, ordain that our bailiffs, viscounts, provosts, mayors, and all others, in whatever matter it may be, in whatever office they may hold, shall make oath. Remember how important oaths are to people in the Middle Ages. So long as they hold the said office or perform the functions of bailiffs, they shall do justice to all, without acceptation of persons, as well as to the poor, as to the rich, and to strangers, as to those who are native born, and they shall observe such uses and customs as are good and have been approved, right? So he's trying to reform the way the government works. They shall swear and promise that if they have knowledge of any official, sergeant, or provost serving under them who is unfaithful, given to robbery and usury, or addicted to other vices whereby he ought to vacate our service, then they will not uphold him for any gift or promise or private affection, or any other cause, but punish and judge him in all good faith, right? That he has to make that proclamation tells us that stuff like this was happening, that some of his royal officials were committing abuses. We order that no bailiff or provost in our service shall burden the good people in his jurisdiction beyond that which is lawful, beyond what is lawful and right, and that none of our subjects be put in prison for any debt, save insofar as such debt may be due to ourselves only. Right, so it seems that these royal representatives had been, they're tax farming, right? They're enriching themselves on the basis of having a position in the government, and Louis is just done with this. And there's more, okay? There's a fair amount more in Joinville, but let's move on and talk briefly about the enquêteurs. These are the enquêtes. Effectively, these are records of complaints, right? So these are special judges called enquêteurs to hear complaints against royal officers, right? And there are lots of these. I mean, you can just kind of grab any example of this and see that all manner of abuses are being committed, right? And so here we have a group of people who are complaining that they were forced by the baillis, these are the royal officials, and revenue farmers of the Lord King to pay a customs duty on all things they sell and purchase. The king almost certainly did not dictate that was supposed to happen, that they just did this of their own accord to make money for themselves. And, in some cases this is money. Some cases they're even taking property, like they wrested from him a certain mill, which he used to hold in fief from the Lord King. So the king, there was some arrangement where the kings had given this person this mill as a fief, and one of these royal officials takes this, and there are dozens of these things. Like, this is a pretty big compendium, and this is only excerpted, the stuff that Geary is providing. You can see the number of these things, right? So these queremoniae, that's the Latin word for complaint, they really do give us a good sense of how problematic government was in this period. Even monasteries, right, are suffering from this and making complaints to the king, as this last one tells us. All right, I want to briefly look at the Magna Carta, which is, of course, a very famous source, particularly for American history. This is seen as a forerunner or a precursor to the to later documents that culminate in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, and Americans often draw a direct line from these things that happened in the Middle Ages. The desire for people's freedom and representative government and all of this. This is not that actually that radical a document, though I would encourage you to read this closely and see what's really going on, given the context, right? Let's remember that John was not a popular king. He was desperately in debt. He was trying to prosecute wars on the continent and in other places. He had lost all of this land, being outmaneuvered by Philip II of France. He had had to debase himself before the Pope and hand over the kingdom as a fief. I mean, John was a very, very poor king by any standard, right? There's a reason that there has not been a subsequent King John in English history. And I say that, given the knowledge that that's my name, right? It doesn't pain me, I guess. But I remember when I was a kid, I was like, why aren't there more King Johns of England? Well, it makes sense learning about this guy. There are really three sources in this little collection, right? You have this thing called the Articles of the Barons. These are the demands that the barons, meaning the nobles of the Kingdom of England, are making of the king. And then you can look closely and see how these get modified in the Magna Carta. But for the most part, the demands of the barons are taken and just inserted into Magna Carta, which is the document that John signed. It was later, and then right after that, you get the document, which is the condemnation of the Magna Carta by Pope Innocent III. I guess, he felt like he owed John something given their contention in the past, and he condemned this document and said this is not the way government ought to work. Of course, the people of England didn't necessarily pay heed to him. And then the last one is essentially John's son Henry, after John died, Henry III, who... There's another document that says, okay, I agree to these things, but I do not accept these provisions of Magna Carta. So he's trying to wriggle his way out of some of the things that John said he would do in this document, right? So there's still some give and take going on well after the Magna Carta was signed, and those debates continue pretty much through the rest of the Middle Ages. You can look at almost any provision in the Articles of the Barons and then Magna Carta itself, and get a sense of the problems that the nobles are facing here, right? And the abuses that are being committed by John, by his government officials, the issues that they're having with the government, right? Number 9 here, that a free man shall be immersed means have a fine levied against them, for a trivial offense in accordance with the degree of the offense. It seems that some people had done something only slightly wrong, and they were, they had major fines levied against them, and even their property seized and stuff like that, right? So it'd be like being fined $1 million for stealing a loaf of bread or something like that. I mean, not literally, but that's what's happening, and they see this as unjust, and they're saying the king can no longer get away with this, or his officials cannot get away with this. They want some standardization of things, in other words, right? That no sheriff or king's bailiff or anyone else shall take the horses or carts of a free man for transport work, save with his agreement. So it seems that royal officials were just commandeering horses and carts and things like that from people and using them in the name of the king, effectively running away with them, right? And so the barons are saying this cannot happen unless the owner of the horse agrees to that. If anyone has been disseized, this means had their property stripped of or kept out of his lands, franchises, and his right by the king without a judgment. That's the important thing here, right? This is the origin of due process, or some have traced due process back to the Magna Carta, right? That there has to be a judicial hearing, so to speak, on anything before a person can be stripped of his property. If this has happened, let it be immediately restored to him, and if a dispute arises over this, and then this is the other important thing, then let it be decided by the judgment of 25 barons, and that those who were disseized by the father or the brother of the king, right? So they're trying to make this retroactive, that anyone under Henry II, who's the father, or under Richard I, his brother, will get justice without delay by the judgment of their peers in the king's court, right? So they're creating a court of peers. English common law did have a trial by jury, But of course, the king is trying to contravene that and act in his own accord. And they're saying if there isn't some kind of process, then the decising, the seizing of property is unjust, and that property needs to be restored to that person, going all the way back to 1154 when, and this is 1215, right? When Henry became king. I don't know how much of that actually happened, but that's the demand they're making. The no bailiff be able to put anyone on trial upon his own bare word without reliable witnesses. So royal officials cannot just, hold a judgment against somebody unless there are witnesses. That the body of a free man, this is habeas corpus. I mean, it's kind of the origin of that, right? That's what it means. You have a body, or you may hold your body, literally is what habeas corpus means. It is yours. The body of a free man be not arrested or imprisoned or disseized by or outlawed or exiled or in any way victimized. Nor shall the king attack or send anyone to attack him with force except by the judgment of his social equals. There again is the jury of peers, or by the law of the land, right? And so this is a step. The Parliament was not created. There really weren't representative institutions created by Magna Carta. And I will say that, if you just kind of go into Magna Carta, you can look through some more of this. I mean, I've highlighted a number of things. Here again is like we're creating a body of these nobles who will make decisions, right? And they can even say, like, the king has done something unjust. They can pronounce on the acts of the king. This is like judicial review of the acts of the king. That, surprisingly, made it into Magna Carta. I mean, the king agreed to this. Of course, he tried to go back on his agreement later, but, you'll see that that's here. It's in this longest section of Magna Carta, section 61. Pretty much the same verbiage and everything, right? Now, as I said, Pope Innocent condemned this, right? And here he notes that King John has yielded the kingdom of England and of Ireland to St. Peter and the Roman Church and received it from us again as a fief under an annual payment of 1,000 marks. It's a lot of money. So he owes a feudal obligation to the Pope, right, which is in the amount of 1,000 marks, having sworn an oath of fealty to us, as is clearly stated in his privilege, furnished with a golden seal. So this is a charter, right? There's a written document that he has provided with a seal that makes it official. And so he's saying, look, John is by divine right king and by the sanction of the papacy, and that's really all that matters. He does not need to answer to the people of England, okay? They are overstepping the bounds of their authority and disrespecting the king in the process. And so that's kind of the gist of this. And then we can see that Henry tries to wriggle out of some of this, right? Anything that you see here I think in the italics is like a change in this. And so this is what Henry tried to say he will do. And then, he says, well, I agree to all these things, but some of these things I'm going to defer until we have fuller counsel on this, right? So he's saying, look, I don't want to obey Magna Carta. I don't think that is retroactive, or that extends to my reign. Of course, this continued to be debated. All right, so hopefully that gives you a pretty good sense of like some of the stakes of government in this period, some of the debates that were happening, and also, in particular, the abuses and the attempts to curb abuses in France from Louis IX himself, and in England from, the nobles who had been, as they felt, victimized by the arbitrary acts of King John. Okay, thanks.